Ray Rice. We didn't get into this yesterday, and and normally I don't talk much about sports, but this is really a much larger issue, and it's how we as Americans are dealing with domestic abuse. Domestic abuse is one of those issues that, arguably 100 years ago, it was just the way it is, right? Men beat up women, so what? It was a non-issue, I've often said that in many ways, misogyny is, if not worse than racism, at least it's the other shoe dropping, right? It is the hatred of women, the oppression of women. I don't think that this is absolutely proves the point, but we got a black president before we got a female president, for example. African Americans were given the right to vote in the 1870s. Women were given the right to vote in the 1920s, in 1920. It has been a long road and a tough haul for women. And it still is. Women earn 70 cents for every dollar that men work. Women are massively underrepresented in the workplace, particularly in the senior offices, the executive offices, in Congress. Now, it's slowly changing, but, part of this is our attitude toward domestic violence. And Ray Rice punches his girlfriend out in the elevator to the point that she's unconscious. And originally the NFL said, oh, okay, we'll slap him on the wrist, 2 games off, which would mean that he'd be playing, next week, I think? We just had the first game of the season for his team. Say that again, Shane? Second one's Thursday, thank you. And isn't it time for us to just say enough already? And by the way, this doesn't just apply to football players beating up girlfriends, fiancés in elevators. There's a woman who has been calling out gamers, for example, for the way women are treated in video games. Women in video games are basically either wallpaper, sex objects, in many cases abusive sex objects. In other words, beat up the woman, rape the woman, kill the woman. But, almost never the heroines of the story. Now, I get it. Most gamers are boys, but is this the message we want to be teaching boys? Yesterday we had a conversation with a fellow. I don't remember if it was a caller or a guest who went on at some length about. I'm pretty sure it was a caller. No, it was our guest who went on at some length about how the traditional role of women has always, or men has always been the protector, the caretaker, the provider. And I'm like, yeah, that has been the traditional role of men. And who came up with that role? Men! Surprise! And so now that women are getting some power, they're saying, doesn't have to be that way. In fact, maybe that's not even the best way. And when you look historically, you look at older cultures, you look at Native American cultures, Asian, European, African, Aboriginal cultures, what do you find? In South American Aboriginal cultures, in a really significant, perhaps large minority or small majority, women-run communities. In the Iroquois Confederacy, it was 5 nations. There was originally 4, and then they added another, a 5th one. And in those 5 nations, 4 of the 5 nations, men could not vote. Women ran the show. The men were the sachems. They would travel the long distances for the annual or semi-annual meetings or biannual meetings of the larger confederacy, but they did not have the power to say anything other than here's what my community thinks, and the community voted on what they thought, and it was the women who did the vote. Why? Because the Iroquois Confederacy's constitution said all decisions are made in the context of its impact on the 7th generation. Can you imagine? And everybody understood that the men weren't all that concerned about the 7th generation, but the women were having babies. They got it. Can you imagine if our legislature, if our Constitution, and Franklin and those guys had this opportunity. Ben Franklin brought 34 elders of the Iroquois Confederacy to the Constitutional Convention in August, or maybe it was July, in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. He brought these guys, and for the first week or so, they were there. They did the opening blessing ceremony of the Constitutional Convention. John Hancock made a big speech welcoming them and thanking them. James Madison did too. Franklin, of course, introduced them. He said, hey, here's a model for us, the Iroquois Confederacy. And this wasn't meant as an insult when he said, you know, if 5 nations of ignorant savages have been able to forge a bond which has stood in peace for over 1,000 years, then certainly 13 colonies of educated Englishmen should be able to do the same. He meant that as a compliment. And that's what he said. So is it time for us to reinvent our norms? Could it be that we've had a dysfunctional and sick society for hundreds of years, that might account for slavery? It might account for the genocide of the Native Americans, this male-dominated society. Is it time for us to wake up and change things?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
And is the beginning of that wake-up when we see Ray Rice beat the crap out of his girlfriend saying, no, buddy, you're not going to be rich anymore.